They called her a witch, and they were wrong. Michi came to Bitter Springs on the back of a supply wagon, the only Japanese woman any of them had ever seen, carrying a lacquered box of needles and dried herbs her grandmother had used in Kyoto before she was born. The town tolerated her because she healed what their whiskey and laudanum could not, and they feared her for the same reason. Then the sickness came, and fear needed a name, and they gave it hers. When the torches reached her door, a rancher who had not spoken to a soul in months set himself between her and certain death, and spoke the most dangerous lie a man could say. Bitter Springs sat in a shallow basin in the Southern Territory, a town that existed because someone had been too tired to go any further. A single street of packed dust, a general store, a saloon with a stone fireplace, a blacksmith, a livery, and a preacher's church, with a bell that rang whether anyone listened or not. The nearest marshal kept his office 2 days' ride north, which meant the law was a rumor, and a man's word was the only authority that held past sundown. The spring that gave the town its name bubbled up behind the general store, mineral-tasted and cold, and every soul in Bitter Springs drank from it because there was nothing else to drink. Michi arrived 6 months back on a supply wagon that came through twice a year, and she stepped down at the edge of town with one wooden trunk and the lacquered box and nothing else. The driver didn't know her name and didn't ask, only that someone in San Francisco had paid him to deliver her this far and no further. She rented the shack at the end of the last street, the one the previous tenant had died in, and she cleaned it herself and hung a cloth curtain across the door and set the lacquered box on the only table. Within a week, the town knew 3 things about her. She was Japanese or Chinese or something else they couldn't tell and didn't try to. She could heal, and she didn't talk. The box was the first thing anyone noticed. Dark wood, brass hinges, a clasp that clicked shut with the sound of something expensive closing. She opened it on the table the day she moved in, and a ranch hand who had come to ask who she was stood in the doorway and watched her line up rows of dried leaves and powders in paper packets, and a set of needles so fine they caught no light at all. He asked her what they were for. She didn't answer. He left, and by evening half the street had heard about the Japanese woman and her box of strange tools, and the story grew in the telling like stories do, when there's nothing else to do in a town at the end of nowhere. She set her price low and her manner lower. A man came to her with a hand split open by a hay knife, and she cleaned it, packed the cut with a paste of crushed leaves that smelled of earth and something sharper, and wrapped it tight, and charged him 2 bits. He came back 3 days later able to close his fist, and he told the saloon, and more came. A woman with a cough that had hung on through winter. A boy of 18 with a broken finger she set straighter than the barber surgeon ever managed. She healed what she could, turned away what she couldn't, and never once explained what she did or why. The town decided she was useful, and the town decided she was strange, and it held both of those opinions at once, the way small places do, with the usefulness winning as long as nothing went wrong. There was one detail in that shack that the ranch hand hadn't understood, and he was the one who gave it its name. Mounted high on the wall, above the table out of the way, hung a long blade on a plain wooden shaft. It wasn't a rifle, and not a sword, and not any tool anyone in Bitter Springs had a word for. The ranch hand called it a witch's staff, and the name stuck among the men at the saloon, even though none of them could say what a witch's staff was supposed to be. Michi heard the name once, through the wall of the general store, and she didn't correct it. She'd learned long ago not to show fear, and she'd learned even longer ago that explaining yourself to people who've already decided what you are is a waste of breath. Clark ran cattle on a spread south of town, 40 head on land that barely fed them, and he did his own fence work, and his own shoeing, and his own everything, because there was no one else out there to do it. He was built the way a man gets built by years of lifting things alone, wide through the shoulders and quiet in the way he moved. And he hadn't spoken to anyone in town beyond the price of grain and coffee in the better part of a year. The town knew his name and his face and nothing else, because he offered nothing else. He had a reputation for silence, not for violence, and in a place where a man's word was law, a silent man was a man who kept his own counsel and let you keep yours. He came into town on a Tuesday for supplies, riding the buckboard because he needed feed and nails and a length of chain, and the men at the general store saw the arm before they saw his face. His left forearm was wrapped in a rag that had been white once and was now the color of old rust, and the smell coming off it was the smell that comes off flesh when it has started to turn. He had caught it on a strand of barbed wire 3 days back while mending a fence line in the south pasture, and he had done what the frontier taught a man to do, which was pour whiskey on it, wrap it, and keep working. The whiskey hadn't been enough. The red had climbed past his wrist and was heading for his elbow, and the skin around the cut had gone the dark purple of a bruise that won't fade. The store owner took one look and sent him to the barber surgeon, and the barber surgeon took one look and told him what he told everyone, which was to drink laudanum and wait and let the body do its work. Clark drank the laudanum and the arm got worse. By the second day he couldn't close his hand, and the fever had started, the low kind that comes on slow and stays. The store owner watched him load the buckboard with one arm and shaking hands, and he said the thing no one in Bitter Springs said lightly. But he told Clark to try the Japanese woman because the barber surgeon had already done his best, and his best wasn't going to be enough. Clark found her shack at the edge of town and stood in the doorway the way men stand when they hate needing help. She looked at the arm once, unwrapped it without asking, and the calm on her face didn't change when she saw what was underneath. She boiled water on a small iron stove, cleaned the wound with a solution that stung enough to make his jaw set, and packed it with a poultice of crushed herbs that smelled of green and pepper and something he had no name for. Then she wrapped it from wrist to elbow with a cloth so clean it looked like it had never been used, and she did all of it with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before and would do it 1,000 times again. He watched her hands. She didn't explain what any of it was, and he didn't ask, because asking would have been a kind of surrender he wasn't ready for. He paid her what she asked, which was less than the barber surgeon, and he left. But something had moved in the space between them, and he felt it before he understood it. Not love, not even trust, but a recognition. Two people who had both learned what it meant to stand alone against forces stronger than themselves, and who had both decided that standing alone was the only honest way to stand. She had looked at him, the way he looked at the land, with the steady attention of someone who'd already accepted the worst it could do, and wasn't going to flinch when it did it. For the first time since she had arrived in Bitter Springs, someone had looked at her and seen a person instead of a curiosity, and she had let him see it, and neither of them had said a word about it. The Winchester 1873 rode in the saddle scabbard on the buckboard the way it always did. Lever action, oiled, a working tool, and not a threat. He bought it used from a man out of Denver, and he'd never missed with it, because a man alone on a spread can't afford to miss. It stayed in the scabbard on the ride home. He didn't need it yet. The sickness started quietly, like sickness does in a place that has seen hard times and assumes every hard time is just another hard time. A ranch hand named Polk, strong and young and not yet 30, woke one morning with a fever and an ache in his knees that he put down to a bad night on a cold bed. By noon his joints had swollen and gone dark at the knuckles, the skin purpling the way Clark's arm had purpled, and by the second day he couldn't stand. The barber surgeon bled him, which was the barber surgeon's answer to everything, and gave him laudanum, which was his other answer, and Polk got worse instead of better. The town had no doctor. It had a barber surgeon who'd learned his trade on a battlefield 15 years back and hadn't learned anything since, and his kit held a saw, a needle, a bottle of laudanum, and the conviction that bleeding balanced the humors. He admitted in the saloon that night that he didn't know what this was. He said it like a man says a thing when he knows saying it will cost him, and it did. The room went quiet, like a room goes quiet when the person whose job is to know doesn't know. And every man there felt the cold edge of that quiet, because if the barber surgeon didn't know what was killing Polk, then the barber surgeon didn't know what would kill any of them. This wasn't a bullet wound, or a broken leg, or a horse kick, the kinds of hurt Bitter Springs understood and had a name for. This was invisible and slow, and it didn't answer to whiskey or laudanum or the saw. Fear entered the town like water enters a crack in a wall, not all at once, but steady, and by the end of the week it had found its way into every conversation. People stopped shaking hands and stopped drinking from the common cup at the well. They started watching each other for the first sign of a swollen joint or a fevered eye, and the watching itself became a kind of sickness. A man would cough in the saloon and the room would go still, every face turning toward the sound, like a herd turns toward a wolf. The man who coughed would hold up his hands to show his knuckles were clean, and the room would breathe again, and the breathing was its own kind of fear. The barber surgeon stopped making house calls after dark because he said the night air carried it, which was nonsense, but nonsense travels faster than sense in a town that has run out of answers. Michi heard about Polk the day after he fell. She came to the saloon where the men had gathered, because that was where decisions got made in a town with no mayor, and she offered to look at him. The barber surgeon turned her down before the words were out of her mouth. He called her methods heathen work, and a few of the men laughed, the hard laugh men use when they're frightened and need to prove they aren't. She stood at the saloon door and didn't argue, because she'd learned long ago that arguing with a man who's already decided is a waste of the breath you need for the work. She turned and walked back the way she came, and the men watched her go, and one of them said the thing that would grow into everything that followed. He said the sickness started after she came. It was a seed, not yet a fire. A sentence spoken to the back of a woman walking away, not loud enough for her to hear, loud enough for the men nearest to hear and to carry home. The town didn't pick it up that night. But it didn't forget it either, and a seed only needs water and time, and the sickness was about to give it both. 3 days later, there were 3 sick, and a week after that there were 5. And by the end of the second week, half the main street had the fever and the swollen, blackened joints and the weakness that wouldn't let a man hold a hammer or a cup. The barber surgeon was out of his depth and said so again. And the second time he said it, the town heard it differently, because the first time there was 1 sick man, and now there were 5, and the number changed what the words meant. A man who doesn't know what is killing 1 person is a problem. A man who doesn't know what is killing 5 is a failure, and the town needed something to replace him with, and fast. Preacher Cobb gave them what they needed. He was a big man, slow-spoken, certain of God and of the devil's work in the world, and his word carried more weight in Bitter Springs than any lawman's, because the lawman was 2 days away and Cobb was there every Sunday. He'd watched Michi from the first week she arrived, distrustful of anything he couldn't fit inside his scripture, and he had waited, because a preacher in a small town learns to wait, for the moment his certainty becomes useful. The sickness was that moment. He preached a Sunday sermon that named her, without naming her, a stranger among them, a woman practicing strange arts, a blight that had arrived on a wagon the same season the fever arrived, and he didn't have to say the word. Crowed. The town said it for him by noon, and the word was witch. The word caught because fear always prefers a face to a mystery, and a face that doesn't look like yours is the easiest face to blame. It made a kind of sense to a town that needed sense, like a drowning man will grab a rope made of anything. She had arrived, and the sickness had arrived, and the two facts sat next to each other, and the town drew a line between them that didn't need to be true, only useful. Cobb didn't push the line. He let the town draw it themselves, because a line a man draws himself is a line he'll defend. They broke into her shack on a Wednesday while she was out gathering wild herbs along the creek, and when she came back the door was open and the inside was wrecked. Her jars of dried medicine lay smashed on the floor, the paper packets torn and scattered, the small iron stove knocked sideways. The lacquered box had been thrown against the wall and had split along one side, a clean crack through the dark wood, and the needles had spilled across the table like spilled seed. She knelt in the wreckage and didn't make a sound. She picked the needles up one by one and laid them back in their places, and she held the split box in her hands, like a person holds a thing that can't be replaced, and her face didn't change, because the kind of calm that only comes from having already accepted the worst possible outcome. Clark heard. He came in on the buckboard for supplies, and saw the men gathered at the end of her street and the wreckage through her open door, and he turned the buckboard without stopping at the store. He found her on her knees among the broken jars, and he didn't speak because there was nothing to say that wouldn't have been a kind of insult to what she was already doing. He knelt beside her and helped her gather, and they worked in silence, and the silence wasn't empty. It was the silence of two people who'd both seen what a town can do to a stranger when it decides the stranger is the cause of its fear, and who didn't need to explain that to each other because they'd both lived it. The recognition from the first day when she had wrapped his arm hardened in that wreckage into something quieter and more permanent, like a wound hardens into a scar that holds the skin together. The wreckage wasn't the worst that was coming. The worst was still 2 days away, and it would come at dusk, and it would come with torches. That night the shack was put back as well as it could be, the stove righted, the jars replaced with what few had survived, the curtain hung again across the door. Clark stayed. It was the first time he'd stayed anywhere but his own ranch in years, and he didn't make anything of it, and neither did she, because making something of it would have been a kind of talking they weren't built for. The lamp burned low, kerosene, the amber light flickering the way it did in the 1,880 seconds, throwing shadows that moved like they were alive. She repaired the box. Not with the frontier glue from the general store, but with a method Clark had never seen a man or a woman use. She mixed a lacquer from tree sap in a small dish, worked it into the crack with a fine brush, and while the lacquer was still wet, she dusted gold powder into the seam, a thin, bright line that followed the break like a river follows a valley. The crack didn't disappear. It became a line of gold running through the dark wood, and when she was done the box was whole again, and the place where it had broken was the most visible part of it, and the strongest. She didn't name what she was doing. She only said, when he watched long enough that the watching became a question, that where it broke was now the strongest part. And she said it, like a person states a fact they've known longer than they can remember. He asked her, once, where she had learned the medicine the hands, and she answered, because he had asked it like a person asks, when they actually want to know, and not when they want to judge. She told him about her grandmother in Kyoto and the old ways, the medicine of needles and herbs, that had been practiced in her family for longer than anyone could count. She explained that even in her own country, the old ways were being pushed aside, that the new Western learning had arrived in Japan the way it arrived everywhere, and that there was no room left for a woman who wanted to work the way her grandmother had worked. She hadn't left because she wanted to. She'd left because there was no place for what she knew, and she'd come as far as the wagon would take her, which was Bitter Springs, which was the end of the earth, and she'd made a practice out of the last of what her family had left. He told her, flat and without softening it, that the town was coming. She said she knew. He asked her why she didn't leave, and she said she'd run before. From Kyoto to the coast, and from the coast to the ship, and from the ship to the wagon, and there was no place far enough to outrun what a town decides you are. Then she asked him why he stayed, and he didn't answer with words. He reached for the Winchester, leaning against the wall by the door, and he checked the lever like a man checks a thing he intends to use, and he set it back, and the sound of the metal was the answer. Two people who had stopped running, together, in a shack at the edge of a town that wanted one of them dead, and neither of them pretending it was going to be anything other than what it was going to be. The sickness took its first life on a Friday, and the life it took was the kind that makes a whole town break. The blacksmith's wife, barely 20, married 3 months, the kind of young woman everyone in Bitter Springs had watched grow up and had a soft word for. She died gasping in the barber surgeon's chair, while he stood over her with his useless needle and his useless laudanum, and her hands had gone so black at the joints that they looked like they belonged to someone older than anyone alive, and there was nothing anyone could do. The blacksmith carried her home and sat on his porch, with her in his arms, and didn't move for an hour, and the town saw him, and the town broke. Preacher Cobb didn't have to work hard that night. The grief became fury before the body was cold, because grief that has nowhere to go will always find a place to go, and the nearest place was the edge of town where the Japanese woman lived. By late afternoon the saloon was full, and the word witch was no longer a whisper but a shout, and someone had produced torches, and the kerosene lanterns threw their amber light the way they did in the 1,880 seconds, flickering and unsteady, the light of a worse century than this one. The light itself looked like something out of the old country, out of a story about what frightened people do when they have a name for their fear and a direction to point it. The mob formed the way mobs form, not all at once, but by accretion, 30 men and a few hard women moving down the single street toward the edge of town with Cobb at the front and a Bible in his hand and the certainty of God in his voice. The torches threw long shadows ahead of them that stretched and shrank with the flicker of the kerosene, so the crowd looked larger than it was and darker than it was, and the sound of it was the sound of boots on dirt and the low hum of voices that had stopped being words. They weren't all monsters. Some of them were frightened people who needed to do something, and doing something to someone is easier than doing something about a disease, and a torch is easier to hold than a question. A few of them had been healed by Michi's hands, and walked anyway, because gratitude is a thin wall against fear, and fear had been hammering on it for weeks. Cobb didn't have to urge them. He only had to walk, and they followed, because a man with a Bible and a direction is a leader in a town that's lost its sense of direction. Michi heard them before she saw them, the sound of boots on packed dirt, and the sound of voices that had stopped being words and become a single low noise, the sound a town makes when it has decided. She stood in the shack and looked at the naginata on the wall, the long blade on its plain wooden shaft, the tool her grandmother had trained her with before the medicine, and she took it down and held it once. Then she set it back on its hooks, because she wouldn't meet them with a blade, and meeting them with a blade would only give them the story they already wanted to tell about what she was. She sat in the chair by the table where the repaired box sat with its gold line, and she waited, and her face was the face of a woman who's already accepted the worst possible outcome and isn't going to flinch when it walks through her door. Then hooves, and the sound of a buckboard coming fast from the south, cutting across the path of the mob, the wheels throwing dust in the amber light, and Clark at the reins. He steps down from the buckboard, and the Winchester is in his hands, lever worked, around in the chamber, and he sets himself between the mob and the door of the shack without a word and without raising the rifle, because he doesn't have to raise it. Every man in that crowd knows what a Winchester 1873 can do at this distance, and every man there knows Clark has never missed, and the rifle across his chest is a fact and not a gesture. The torchlight falls on his face, and on the barrel, and on the door behind him, and the crowd stops, because a crowd will always stop for a man who isn't afraid of it. Cobb speaks first, because Cobb always speaks first, and his voice is the voice of God and the town and every certainty a man can hide behind. He tells Clark to step aside, that this does not concern him, that the woman is the cause of the plague and must answer for it before God and before the town. Clark says nothing. The silence is the answer, and the silence is longer and heavier than any words, and the men at the back of the crowd begin to shift, like men shift when they feel the weight of what is coming settle on them. Cobb pushes, because a preacher who's led a mob this far can't turn it around with a shrug. He tells Clark he is bewitched too, that the woman has addled his mind with her arts, that a God-fearing man wouldn't stand between a town and its justice. Clark lets the word hang in the air like a challenge. Then he speaks 3 sentences, and his voice doesn't rise because the rifle does the shouting. The first is the lie, that's my wife. The second is the warning, she is not your problem. The third is the threat, and he delivers it like a man delivers a thing he has already decided, flat and without heat. The next man who steps on this porch leaves his boots on it. The mob wavers. They are frightened people, not killers, most of them, and a rifle pointed at uncertainty is heavier than a torch pointed at a stranger, and the math of it begins to change behind their eyes. A man in the second row lowers his torch, and the man next to him does the same, and the lowering moves through the crowd like doubt moves, one at a time. The light at the front is brighter than the light at the back, and the front is where Cobb is standing, and Cobb is the only one whose torch is still high. Cobb won't be the first to test Clark, because Cobb can read a man the way he reads his scripture, and what he reads in Clark's eyes is the kind of calm that's already accepted the cost and is only waiting to see who will make him pay it. Cobb steps back. The mob pulls back with him, the torchlight retreating down the street like the tide retreats from a shore it has decided not to take, and the couple is left standing in the dark with the smell of kerosene and the sound of their own breathing. But the threat isn't gone. Cobb leaves with a promise that the law will come, that no lie about a wife will protect a witch from God's justice, and he means it like a man means a thing when his certainty's been challenged in front of the people who follow him. The marshal is 2 days away, and Cobb will send for him, and the open loop is the question of whether a rifle and a lie will hold longer than a preacher's patience. The door closes behind them. Michi looks at him, and he hasn't asked if the lie is all right, and she hasn't thanked him, because thanking him would have made it a favor, and it wasn't a favor. Not love, not even trust, but a recognition. Deeper now, the day she wrapped his arm, the recognition of 2 people who've both decided to stop running and to stand in the same place against the same thing. He stays the night. The rifle leans against the door, and the gold line in the box catches the last of the lamp's amber light, and neither of them sleeps, and there's nothing they need to say. 2 days pass and the marshal hasn't come yet, but something else has. Michi has been working, not from her shack, but in secret, sneaking out at night to the homes of the frightened who care more about living than about scripture. Clark goes with her, the buckboard muffled with cloth over the wheels, and she works the poultices and the needles in lamplight while he stands at the door with the Winchester and watches the dark. Some of the sick get better. Not all of them, but enough that the ones who let her in begin to talk, and the talking is a kind of seed of its own, slower than cobs, but planted in soil that's ready for it. Michi has known or suspected strongly enough that it amounts to the same thing, what the sickness is. And it isn't witchcraft, and it isn't a curse, and it isn't anything Cobb has a sermon for. It's the water. The spring that gave Bitter Springs its name, the one cold mineral spring behind the general store that every soul in town has drunk from since the day the town was built, has turned. She has seen this once before in a village near her grandmother's home, in the hills above Kyoto, the same blackened joints and the same fever from a well gone bad with mineral poison that had leached in from the rock after a season of heavy rain. She tried to tell the barber surgeon in the first days when Polk was the only one sick, and he called it heathen work and sent her out of his shop, and the town drank the water for 2 more weeks, while the sickness grew. The proof arrives without her asking for it. A cattle hand on Clark's spread. A man who's never drunk from the town spring because he draws his water from the creek on the ranch, hasn't fallen ill, and hasn't fallen ill while half the main street has. Clark mentions it to the barber surgeon offhand, like a man mentions a thing he doesn't yet know is important, and the barber surgeon hears it and goes quiet, like a man goes quiet when a piece he didn't know he was missing falls into the shape he's been staring at. Cornered by his own failing and by the number of dead he can't explain, he finally tests the spring water the way Michi told him 2 weeks ago, and finds it tainted with the mineral that's been poisoning the town 1 cup at a time. The sickness was never Michi. The sickness was the town's own water, the thing they built their lives around and never questioned, because the thing you have always drunk from is the last thing you think to suspect. Preacher Cobb doesn't apologize, because men like him never do, and an apology would have been a kind of surrender his certainty can't afford. But the word witch dies in the town's mouth over the next week, not because they're ashamed, but because they're embarrassed, which is close enough to justice for a place like Bitter Springs, where justice is a rumor the way the law is a rumor. Some of the sick, ones Michi treated in secret, recover. The ones who refused her, some of them don't, and the town digs graves and doesn't talk about why the graves are there. And the silence around the graves is the closest thing to an accounting the town will ever give. The lie becomes truth without a scene and without a speech, because Clark isn't a man for scenes, and Michi isn't a woman for speeches. He simply doesn't leave, and she doesn't ask him to. The rancher who needed no one, and the healer who had nowhere left to run, build something at the edge of a town that doesn't deserve them. A life made of morning coffee and fence work, and the slow trust of 2 people who've stopped pretending they're alone. The naginata stays on the wall. The rifle leans by the door. The medicine box holds its gold line, and the place where it broke is the strongest part. And that's the only sermon this story knows how to preach. 2 people who chose to stand when a town chose to run, built a life at the edge of a place that never learned to be worth them. The town didn't really change, but 2 people did, and maybe that's all it ever is. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels, and hit that like button.